Good Sunday afternoon. This is Tom Edmondson. Today is Sunday, August the 30th, 2020. If you see me sitting at my desk in my office, that means that something went wrong with the feed today, and it happened to be our streaming computer. We know that we streamed, but we don't know where we streamed to, and there's no telling where that service is going to wind up. My apologies. We had a new person in the booth today, and we're working to find somebody who can be our regular sound booth person. But until that happens, we're, likely to make such mistakes, for which I apologize. But today, thought I would come back into my office and record the message again and share with you what I shared with our congregation who were here. We had about our usual group, which was about 20 or so. And then I know that we had a lot of people who probably tried to come online and didn't find us, for which I apologize. I'm going to switch between my screen and sharing my screen with you. These are the slides, obviously, from today. And our text was 1 Corinthians 13, verses 11 and 12, which I shall read to you now from the New Revised Standard Version. When I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became an adult, I put an end to childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we shall see face to face. Now I know only in part. Then I will know fully, even as I am fully known. Now, for the moment, I will switch back, but first I will show you. This is my slide for today, and our topic is growing up our image of God, for lack of a better title. We began this series back at the beginning of the month, and we have talked about various periods in the history of ancient Israel. We talked about Moses as someone who may have had disappointed expectations in God in his early life. We talked about the people of Israel who somehow thought that they could control or manipulate God in using the Ark of the Covenant to defeat their enemies, and that didn't work out so well for them. And of course, we talked about Elijah, who had his own hang-ups in terms of his disappointment with God. What I hope to demonstrate through all of these messages up to this point is that the human understanding of God, who God is, has to grow. It has to mature. And we see examples, as I have pointed out in the scriptures, of how people had to sort of grow out of whatever those disappointments were. Then last week we talked about Paul taking the message of the gospel on the road, and we used two examples from his preaching in the Greek world, one in Corinth, one in Athens. And briefly in Corinth was a church that he had founded, but there was a lot of squabbling, a lot of issues going on in that church. And among them, the question was, can we be faithful Christians and buy meat? Because in the meat markets, you could only buy meat that had been slaughtered at a temple to an idol of some sort. And Paul gives them a very Jewish sounding Old Testament lesson. We know that there is only one God and so forth, and that idols are nothing. And so the real issue there became not whether eating food that was sacrificed to idols was somehow giving credence to those idols, but instead they should make their choice based upon how it would be received by their fellow believers. The other example of Paul preaching on the Areopagus, or the hilltop there in Athens, where for centuries Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and their followers began to teach, and then other groups of philosophy, other schools had developed there. And in the midst of all of these philosophical ideas, and in the midst of all of these different gods and goddesses that were being worshipped in that day, Paul said, I've noticed that you had a shrine to the unknown God. This is the God that I'm going to declare to you. Paul probably knew then what we know from studies of anthropology and sociology, that when people worship an idol, they're not really worshiping the block of wood or the stone or the gold. they're letting that be sort of a transitional object to point them beyond to another reality. When people worship ancestors, or they worship spirits, or they worship the spirits at a particular river or at a certain mountain, it's not that they don't believe that there's a higher supreme being. It's that they don't think that they can know that supreme being, but they believe that the spirits are somehow an intermediary between them and that higher being. That's not what the Bible teaches us. The Bible teaches us that God, the supreme being, even if the word being is not even a proper term to use for God, that this ultimate reality does communicate with humanity and is not to be confused with with nature itself, or with other human beings. And so as that lesson finally sort of sunk in to the Jewish people over time, God himself became man, as we read in Colossians chapter 1, verses 15 through 20. This is what Paul wrote of Jesus there in Colossians. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For in him all things in heaven and on earth were created, things visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or powers. All things have been created through him and for him. He himself is before all things, and in him all things hold together. So here we have language of God, that Jesus is that pre-existent, that ultimate supreme being. And on the other hand, we have this language of flesh and blood, that he became visible, that he was firstborn over all creation. In a sense, this is the metaphor that Jesus was like a big brother, to use the metaphor, for us, an example. As we go on and read a little further in this passage, verse 19, for in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him God was pleased to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, by making peace through his blood on the cross. That there is an image of God that was flesh and blood and easy for us to view and to understand and to find God in a way that we can't learn from nature or from idols or from other things. But do we have issues, God issues today? Do we still experience discomfort or disappointment with God? Do we sometimes find that God does not live up to our own expectations? The answer, of course, is yes. Sometimes when we feel the absence of God, this void, it's like we've lost a loved one. It's like someone has died. Some people never recover from that. Similarly, sometimes if we lose a loved one, and it could be even an elderly member of the family who lived a long life and died peacefully in their sleep, sometimes that loss of a loved one can also cause us to feel that absence and that void. And it even makes us to wonder if there really is a God. Sometimes people take this feeling of absence or void to an extreme, which of course would be atheism. And in our world today, there are various kinds of atheism. In some ways, there is what I would call a fashionable atheism. There were, various times throughout history, people who proclaimed the death of God. I'm going to share my screen again, if I can remember how to do this. I'll get it just 1 second. Share screen. Here we go. In 1882, Friedrich Nietzsche wrote a book, or published a book, which in English is translated The Gay Science. Sometimes it's called The Joyful Wisdom. But in that book, he proclaimed that God is dead. Now, he was an atheist in the first place, so it's not like he thought that God had gotten, too old and just simply died. But he was referring to the concept of God as a major idea in European thought. He said that God had died And he actually worried about the consequences of what would happen in the resulting years as the idea of God died. What would fill in the vacuum there? So it's not that he was necessarily joyful about it, but he certainly believed that God had died as an idea. If we look at European history, we know that the church in that late 19th century and throughout the 20th century declined greatly. And Europe is a very secular place today, not to say that there aren't good, faithful believers there. And if we look at the trend, if we look at how things happened in Europe, we may say that the United States is on a course following that. Maybe we're 50 or so years behind them, but clearly belief in God, and particularly attendance in worship and so forth, is in a great decline in our own day. Similarly, the other person you see pictured here is a professor named Thomas J.J. Altizer, who taught at Candler School of Theology at Emory, would you believe? And I mention that because Ann and I both have master's degrees from Emory, from Candler School of Theology. And of course, we never met him, but he taught back in the 1960s. And his field is called radical theology, and his book is pictured here, The Death of God. Certainly, the title alone is geared to sell a lot of copies. On the right side, you'll also see that he was featured in Time magazine. This is just one time, but he was actually featured twice. And for him, the whole God is dead theology was a way of taking Nietzsche's idea and blending it with Hegelian dialectic. I know that sounds boring, but let me just say that for the most part, unless you're an academic, it really means nothing. It's the sort of thing that if you have a good professorship and you have regular income and you have time to sit around and talk about ideas, it's the sort of thing that you can talk about. But it doesn't really translate into helpful day-to-day life, and it certainly doesn't get us anywhere intellectually or theologically in the church. I think he probably had good intentions with what he was doing, but I don't really find that useful in my thinking or in my work. I mentioned Nietzsche and Altizer just as examples of what we might call fashionable atheism. It's very fashionable in our day and age for people to, to say, well, I don't really believe in religion, or I don't believe in God, or I don't believe in organized religion, or whatever. And they might let something like this be their excuse. Well, the reason I mention this, of course, is because we're talking about maturing or growing up our image of God. Rather than just, chunking it, throwing it all out with the bathwater, maybe we have to grow up a little bit in our faith and our understanding of who God is throughout our experiences. But I will mention one more example real quickly, and that is the example of Elie Wiesel. I don't know if you've read the book Night. It's a very short, easy to read book. You can read it in one or two settings. The problem, of course, is that it's a memoir of his experience in the concentration camps in Europe. He and his family were taken from their home one night. It was he and his father. I'm going to share my screen again with you. He and his father and mother and his sister, and they were put on a train, and they were, of course, taken to Auschwitz. And they were unloaded from the train, just like so many others. And he and his father were sent one way, and his mother and sister were sent a different direction. Because, what basically happened is they had a doctor, the Nazis had a doctor, somebody there looking as people came off, and they would tell them to go to this line or go to that line. So Elie Wiesel and his father were in one line. It turned out to be the line where they assigned them a place to stay and a job. They would basically take all of their clothes, shave all their hair off, tattoo a number on their arm, give them the striped clothing and so forth. So he wondered, of course, naturally, where his mother and sister had gone off to. And after a while, he asked the question, where are they? And someone pointed to a smokestack that was billowing smoke into the air. And of course, the really awful realization came upon him that his mother and sister had been gassed and then set in the crematorium to be burned up. And in this book, you read these words: "Never shall I forget the nocturnal silence which deprived me for all eternity of the desire to live. Never shall I forget those moments which murdered my God and my soul and turned my dreams to dust. Never shall I forget these things, even if I am condemned to live as long as God himself. Never." We can only try to imagine the horror that such an event uh, would impose upon a soul. And, you know, Wiesel is so eloquent in his presentation of that absolute sense of loss and despair. And it wasn't just that he lost a mother or a sister, but in that moment, his own view of God was that God had himself had been killed. You know, our view of God influences our view of humanity, but also our view of humanity influences our view of God. And that's why I said we can lose a loved one. And what does it do? It creates this sense of void. And many times, even if it's under happy circumstances, we feel the absence of God. We can only imagine how much worse it would be to be standing in a concentration camp and looking at the smoke rising of dear loved ones who hours earlier were by your side and are now going up in smoke. We were created in the image of God to reflect the image of God. That's what it says in Genesis 1:27. And it says that he created them male and female. And when we bow to an idol, when we find something else that is a substitute or a mediator between us and God, if it is less than God, there's a real sense in which we are dehumanizing ourselves. To think or to imagine that God is like a statue, or that God is like an animal, or that God is like some aspect of nature. That the highest representation of God on earth is flesh and blood, it's humans. And thus we can see how the loss of life can create a sense of void, and even that sense of loss of God from time to time, but also the presence of that flesh, the presence of a loved one, of a spouse or a friend, can also be like the confirmation of the presence of God. And ultimately, as I mentioned earlier, that God became flesh and blood in Christ so that we would have an example that we of the image of God that we could actually see and touch and feel and imitate. The use of the language of firstborn to refer to Christ is a way of saying that metaphorically, he's our big brother, that through him we can sort of get an idea of what it means to embody and to reflect the image of God. But we also know that when Jesus hung on the cross, he quoted from Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Even in that moment, one who was both God and human mixed together, understood that sense of loss and that sense of the absence of God. We come to the words of our text today, 1 Corinthians 13, verses 11 and 12. Paul says, "When I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child." And I can remember, I have a memory of when I was about 5 or 6 years old. I went to Sunday school in my home church in Dalton, and my Sunday school teacher, her name was Cheryl, she taught us that day that whatever we ask for in Jesus' name, God is going to give us. And so we, had worship, we had lunch, and then I was sent to my room for a nap. I remember lying on that bed, looking sort of at the window, the curtains were covering it, not sleepy at all. And I thought, well, I guess I could pray. So that afternoon, I prayed to God for all of these things that I wanted, because I knew that if I asked in Jesus' name, that I would receive what I asked for. And I remember asking for a lot of things that at the age of 5 or 6, I really wanted. Toys, of course, uh, probably I had a big Jim doll where you pushed the button in the back and you had the karate chop action. So I think I probably wanted some of the other characters to go with it, maybe some Marvel comics like Spider-Man and Captain America characters to go with it. I remember distinctly praying for scuba gear. I wanted the wetsuit, I wanted the mask, I wanted the tank, and I wanted the flippers. And I asked for an awful lot of things, and that was a long time ago, and now I'm almost 52, and I haven't received any of that stuff yet. And of course, the point is that I was thinking about God from the perspective of a 5 or 6-year-old. Some people, they get older, and their understanding of God doesn't grow with them. And so somewhere along the line, they have one of these experiences in life, and it could be the loss of a loved one. It could be the loss of a job. It could be just frustrated expectations. It could be something really serious, though. It could be cancer. It could be that you had cancer, and then you went through the treatment and it got better, and then it came back. It could be any number of things. And for some people, it's something really dramatic, and for some people, it's not so dramatic. And if our understanding of God doesn't grow up with us, he becomes our target. We bail on him. And then all of a sudden we're saying, well, if this is the way it's going to be, then there's no God, or none of this is true. And we just lose sight of God. This is what I would not only call a fashionable atheism, but I would also say that it's childish, as Paul would say. And I will just point out to you that Friedrich Nietzsche was the son of a minister, the grandson of a minister, the brother-in-law of a minister. I mean, practically he has the same pedigree as James Dobson, surrounded by ministers, and yet the faith was not reproduced in him. Instead, he rejected it all. Paul says, when I became an adult, I put aside childish ways. Remember now that those words are couched within the larger context of 1 Corinthians chapter 13, the chapter on love. Paul is dealing with a church in Corinth that is squabbling over who's more important than somebody else. What is the right way to do this? Why are you tolerating this immorality? There's all kinds of issues that are going on there that are very much like our world today. And the climax of that letter, chapter 13, one of the most beloved and well-known passages in all the Bible. Love is patient, love is kind. Love does not envy, does not boast, does not keep record of wrongdoings. On and on and on. But then he gets to this point about when I was a child, I acted and thought like a child. Well, he certainly described a lot of that in there, particularly talking about envying and boasting and so forth. But also notice what he says in verse 12. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we will see face to face. Now I know only in part, then I will know fully, even as I have been fully known. There's a real sense in which Paul is telling us is to grow up our understanding of God. What we see now is dim. It's like a reflection in a mirror. And, in Paul's day, they didn't have mirrors like we have today where you can see a very accurate image of yourself. He didn't have a cell phone where he could take a selfie and take a look and say, oh, I need to comb my hair. They had polished metal that they could see a reflection in, but it was not as crisp and clear as what we know. And the whole point is that it's a great metaphor for our understanding of God and of the world, that what we see is only a reflection, a dim reflection. We don't fully understand. And so, hopefully, at the age of 52, I understand God better than I did at the age of 6. But I'm hoping that when I hit 62 and 72 and 82, that my understanding will be better. But I do understand that God will always be beyond my grasp. Because if he's not beyond my grasp, then he's not God. And it is not up to me to put conditions onto what God can or cannot do, or what God should or should not do. It's up to me to be faithful. It's up to me to search for God and to reach for him and to find him. As Paul wrote to the church, as Paul spoke to the philosophers there on Mars Hill, or the Areopagus in Athens, in Acts chapter 17, verses 26 and 27, he says, from one ancestor he made all nations to inhabit the whole earth, and he allotted the times of their existence and the boundaries of the places where they would live, so that they would search for God and perhaps grope for him and find him. The answer to the question that we have been asking all month long, where is God? Is that he is near to each of us if we have the faith to look for him, and if we have the maturity to accept God for who God is. That is my message and my challenge to you today. Let God be God. Let's put aside our childish understandings. Let's put aside our expectations, and let's let God be God, because God is infinitely greater and better than whatever we can conceive. God bless you, and I pray that you'll receive this message with an open heart and an open mind.